All right. We might experience some more people coming in throughout the event, but I think that is all welcome. So first of all, I want to invite you or welcome you all to the Bellona Pavilion, together with our partners in Aker Horizons, Sahara Forest Project, and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. For those of you who already know Bellona, you know that we are an NGO that focus on identifying, enabling, and actually getting the right solutions online or on the ground. And this is also the case when it comes to climate finance. And we know that one of the greatest challenges we have is how to finance a just and green transition. And key to this is risk reduction. And here we need to look at our toolbox. We need to reevaluate our toolbox. What tools are we using that are working, not working, and are there things we haven't thought about that we need to focus more on? So with this great panel and speakers and moderator, I am going to first present our keynote speaker, which is the Norwegian Minister for International Development, Beathe Tvinnereim. So please give her a round of applause.
Thank you so much. Is it okay if I stand here? And now, can you hear me? Yeah, that's wow. Thumb up. That's amazing. It's a challenging environment, but with good spirits, it'll work. Now, on the outset, I'd like to underline how the Norwegian government is seeing climate efforts as the other side of the coin of development efforts. This has to go hand in hand, and the fight against climate change is a cornerstone in my policies, in the government policies. And just to ensure that we actually reach the goals set out in the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, it's essential that we actually delivered on the promised support to developing countries. And rest assured that Norway will deliver on its pledge from last year on doubling support to climate finance by at least by 2026, and within that tripling support to climate adaptation. And I repeat that on every opportunity I have, because I get the question a lot, especially from my African colleagues. We will deliver. But delivering public support is not enough, obviously. A huge slot of this money must come from private funds. And that inspired Norway to set up a speedy setup, I'd like to add, of a new climate investment mechanism called the Climate Investment Fund. It's a 10 billion Norwegian crowns fund managed by Norfund, which is a Norwegian development finance institution. It became operational this spring, and the objective is to invest in renewable energy projects where you can actually cut emissions from fossil fuels. So we have identified a few core countries where we see that the potential for phasing out fossil fuel is specific or especially high. And I have mandated that Climate Investment Fund to take higher risk, especially in order to attract private capital to projects that otherwise would not have been realized. And Norfund has estimated that they will be able to mobilize almost 800 million Norwegian crowns in private capital to climate financing next year. And that includes both the climate investment funds and the other investments that Norfund has. And this climate investment fund has already put 1.8 billion Norwegian crowns to work in efforts to reduce or avoid future emissions in India and in South Africa. And the aim is that the fund will invest 2.8 billion crowns by the end of the year. So it's getting functional very quickly. As I said, it's just half a year since it was formally introduced. I had the great privilege of announcing the first investment in Cape Town a while ago, and that investment in South Africa alone will contribute to avoid emissions equivalent to 12.5% of Norway's annual emissions. And it's not to brag, but I just think we should get a little bit of credit back home for the work that we are doing international as well, because the volumes are there. We are getting things done. Now, of course, increasing the generation of power it's important, but it's not enough, because we also have to get significant and targeted investments into the infrastructure, into electricity networks. And that is why we also have, through Norfund, set up a new investment area, which we call green infrastructure, which is new and which I have great expectations for. And just to state again, energy or financing renewable energy, it's not only about climate policy, it's also about development policy, because we need to make sure that economic growth in developing countries is based on renewables and not the opposite. And we know that there is, up to 1 billion people just in sub-Saharan Africa without access to electricity. I think that's maybe the most valuable contribution I, as Minister of International Development, can give to the green transition is making sure that those people get access to energy without having to get stuck with the old fossil technologies. So that's why I'm happy to note that just last year alone, 3.5 million households were provided with access to affordable energy from companies in Norfund's portfolio. So we are delivering. Just finally, a few words on guarantees. That is really a very efficient way to mobilize the private investments. According to the OECD, 39% of all private sector mobilization for development was due to the availability of guarantees. That is between 2012-2018. So almost 40% of all investments in these countries were due to guarantee schemes. So we have to step up on that, and we need to tailor those guarantees to sectors where the financing gap is specifically big, or where the risk is high or perceived to be high, because that is also a key message to private investors. We see that the perceived risk is sometimes higher than the actual risk. And that is, that responsibility is on the private investors. They have to actually get out there and crack some myths about the risk. Norway has a very ambitious initiative to promote guarantees through partnerships, particularly with the World Bank. Just last year on the COP, we introduced the MIGA with the World Bank. We also have schemes with the African Trade Insurance Agency, where Norway provides first loss guarantees, or first loss capital, to increase the guarantees offered by these institutions. And I think it's quite exciting. It's fairly new and giving quite a promise. So to end off, I think we have a lot of the solutions out there, also on financing, but we just have to get all hands on deck and get the volumes up. So that is basically my message. I want to use my relatively scarce ODA to generate or to release the private capital out there. And we are ready to step up on new solutions, new mechanisms, and new ways of doing it if all other hands are on board as well. So just let's get our heads together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So that sets a good stage for the next part of the event. Very motivating. So let's see what we can do. So with that, I am going to introduce you to the person who's going to guide us through this event, and this is our moderator, Heidi Finskas, who's the Vice President for Corporate Responsibility at KLP. So please give her a warm applause.
Thank you
so much, Lina. Thank you to the Minister for the keynote speech. The backdrop of this session is that there is a big disconnect where the money is and where the need is. Of all available capital in the world, just a few percentages are actually invested in developing countries. A few percentages, that's very, very little. And we know that there's a huge investment gap. But unfortunately, the trend of mobilizing private capital is actually going in a wrong direction. We're seeing less private capital going into emerging markets, not more. So the question is, what are we doing to stop that, change that trend, and move it in another direction? So that is really what we're here to discuss, and we'll take the challenge from the minister. Let's get our heads together and think about new ways of financing, new ways of mobilizing private capital to emerging markets. I myself represented KLP, a pension company from Norway, so I'm thus a representative of the institutional capital that we would like to mobilize. We have indeed thought in a new way at KLP. We have invested in emerging markets for 10 years now. I mean, direct investments into renewable energy, into financial sector in emerging markets. We've done that together with Norfund, and we also the first private investor to invest together with the Norwegian state in this climate investment fund that the minister just mentioned. Very good results, I must say. We have competitive returns, and we've been now part of building 21 new renewable power plants in emerging markets during 8-9 years. So impact and financial returns hand in hand. So to the challenge. What can we do to mobilize more private capital? How can we de-risk? Not get too big shocks here, but how can we de-risk investments? With me today, I have a panel of experts to share their reflections and ideas. And then okay. Let's try to adjust the technical issues there. Is that better? Yeah. So yeah, a distinguished panel with experts here to share their reflections on what we can do. What are the barriers? What's stopping investments and capital to flow to emerging markets, and what can we do about it? So let's jump right into it. Leah, we'll start with you. Blended finance, that's a concept that many are now lifting up as one of the new key solutions. But I don't think that many of you are very familiar with what the concept means, but one of the experts on it, that's Leah Pedersen. You're from Convergence. Convergence is a global network for blended finance with both public, private, and philanthropic investors. And Leah, you are the Senior Director of Convergence, so please share your experience and your ideas of how blended finance can contribute.
One or two mics floating. Okay, hopefully, is this good for everybody? Okay, great. Okay, this is, what's more challenging, mobilizing private capital or speaking at COP? I haven't decided, I'm still figuring that out. So I do have a few slides to share. And quite frankly, they're a bit robust, to say the least, and comprehensive. So, and I have about five minutes, so I better get started. The minister, frankly, did a great job on blended finance. And so I don't know how much more I have to add after our keynote speaker, but I'll try my best. And thank you to Bellona for the invitation, as well as Heidi for all that you're doing here, too. So Convergence, a tool to mobilize finance, and specifically blended finance. Blended finance, why is it required? Last year at COP, there was a statement made, I think multiple statements around the need for blended finance. Now we're doubling down on the conversation, discussing specifically structures and how to get there and the usage. So that's the intention of this presentation. And Heidi, you'll keep me tight. Excellent. So with that, I do want to, this may be a bit of a repeat for some folks. It may be new information for others. So we'll just jump right in. And second, want to highlight that today at COP, I think we're going to have some important key takeaways on blended finance as a whole. So blended finance, you might have seen this little diagram. It's meant to say more or less that development funding is key to mobilizing private capital. Certainly we know about de-risking, we know of other elements. And then second to that, there's enhancing the market rate return of investments and leading to blended finance structures. What's important about this slide? The key thing is that blended finance is actually an approach to structuring. It's not meant to be confused with impact investing. And it's meant to specifically address the SDG financing gaps. In the case of climate finance, one of the latest climate financing gaps I've heard is 1 trillion or more. It's probably more. What are the 3 most important takeaways or aspects of blended finance that you should keep in mind if you're structuring a solution? 1, leverage. We know about leverage. That leverage rate based on historicals is around 5 to 1. That means for every dollar that a development organization puts into a structure, it should technically catalyze or crowd in about $5 of private capital. That also ratio should ebb and flow. Important to keep in mind. If you're working in fragile states, for example, I would expect a ratio of more like 2 to 1. If you're working in emerging markets that are no longer frontier, perhaps in renewables, perhaps that ratio looks a little bit more like 10 to 1. Impact. Blended finance is meant as an approach to move us closer to SDGs. So clear impact is identified ahead, measured along the way. Returns. These transactions should produce returns, ideally at market rate. Some cases, concessionality is introduced, and that's along the life cycle, typically, of a blended finance transaction. But investors need to feel comfortable that a return is on its way, whether it's patient or in a sort of 5 to 7 year period. So I will go through this slide very quickly. Most folks are aware why blended finance is technically needed. It's really hard to exit some of these markets, pull out pension funds, recap, refinance, do all that good stuff. There's limited mandates in terms of investing. There's adjustments in terms of risk and reward ratios, et cetera, et cetera. So it's challenging. The barriers are there. Blended finance is a solution. This is a very important slide that I want to dig into a bit further. And again, the minister actually did a fantastic job of this. There are about 4 different archetypes within blended finance that tend to be the ones that are pointed to. That is not to suggest there can't be more. So please, please, please always think about innovation. We are developing the next generation of financial tools and products. The first example is the usage of first loss. First loss, you hear multiple times. It's meant to adjust return ratio, et cetera. I'd also like to think of it, and I feel very confident that it's meant also to provide downside protection for investors, or at least give them the sense that it's there to provide downside protection. No one wants to see a fund go belly up, but if it does, if I get $1 out and I put 10 in, that can be helpful. And typically this structure is, the first loss is typically a fund structure, either equity or debt. The next would be a similar structure, which is providing guarantees alongside the structure. Similar in that the intent is very, very similar around protecting investors, protecting that investment. Guarantees, frankly, have been used for hundreds of years, thanks to Lloyd's of London and other operators. The question now is how can they be used, and I need to speed along, how they could be used for mobilizing private capital. Third would be TA facilities. You're a private equity firm, you have a portfolio company, you're focused on climate, you actually can benefit from a technical assistance facility to invest in your portfolio companies. When I say invest, I mean grant capital to really continue to move their machinery along. Maybe capital that you as a private equity company or private equity firm can't necessarily invest due to your 2 and 20 rule. And grant capital, very early stage grant capital. That's at the design phase of some of these solutions to suggest We don't know it all, so let's allow innovators who are focused on developing the next wave of business models for nature-based solutions to step in the gap and use blended finance in order to raise private capital. I'm going to look to Heidi because I do have more slides. And 1 minute. 1 minute. Okay, good. Well, let's do this. I think overall, blended finance has accounted for, blended finance transactions have accounted for close to $200 billion since 2010. That does seem rather low. So we really want to see enhanced commitment to the usage of these structures. Doesn't mean they don't work. It just means that and there's a progression, there's continued progression upwards. This is to suggest what geographies are using blended finance most. It tends to be sub-Saharan Africa. Asia tends to use these vehicles as well on a steady growth path there. Recent commitments in Asia would also indicate that I think there'll be increased usage of blended finance. And I'll end with this slide in that blended finance is meant to be a solution to address the Sustainable Development Goals. There are obviously a lot of Sustainable Development Goals. Is it the right one for every goal? The answer is no. So step back and ask yourself, where does it make sense? Then also ask yourself, what are the undercapitalized SDGs? I think of life below water. That's an undercapitalized SDG that can benefit from blended finance. So with that, I'll end and hand it to the next guest speaker.
Thank you, Leah. So now let's get a private sector perspective on this, on investments in emerging markets. Let's meet a company with a truly global footprint, Yara, the world's leading crop nutrition company and provider of agricultural solutions. Welcome to Bernhard Stormyr, Yara's Vice President for Sustainability Governance. Bernhard, you've said that the highest cost of capital is in emerging markets where the investment needs are also the greatest. So how come and what can we do to de-risk?
Hi, so first of all, thanks for inviting Yara to speak here at this important event. Just a reflection before I head into the food system. So as Yara, we are a global company, so we have large-scale investments into India, Colombia, Brazil, Trinidad. In the past, also into Libya. That one wasn't really a success, as you may imagine, in hindsight. Just to illustrate that you can do good business in developing economies, but you also carry substantial risk. But the main point that I wanted to make here is not about the billion-dollar company perspective on investments, but really on the food system and looking in particular at developing economies. And we know that the smallholder farmers are really the backbone of the food system, in particular in developing economies. And we also know that these smallholder farmers have just about the highest cost of capital for any stakeholder anywhere in the world. And we know that these smaller farmers are really vulnerable to the physical climate change that is coming. We will have changes in precipitation patterns. There will be more droughts, but also more floods, as we have seen this very year. And that's going to continue to increase and make the food system more vulnerable and more risky. We know that to build the resilience in agriculture, we need to invest. We need the farmers to invest into their own farms, to change the farm management systems. We need to have infrastructure investments at the landscape level to, example given, have water catchment areas so that you can prevent, to a certain extent, flooding, and you can also have water available if and when there's a drought coming. So we're in a situation where the food system, in particular in developing economies, depends upon adaptation and resilience investments in a situation where the key stakeholders of this system are the ones carrying the highest cost of capital. And that's not a very good starting point, is it? I can include also not just the smallholders, but let's also just consider the commercial scale farmers They are operating both in developing economies and in developed economies. So it's not like you have commercial in Europe and you have small scale in Africa. You also have commercial small scale farmers, but so it's a complex picture there. But if you consider the commercial farmers, they should do investments into new farm technology that can support them. Example given, to sequester more carbon into their soils and to apply regenerative agricultural practices. So this gives the farmers a cost. They will build resilience for their farm, but this is also a public good. It builds resilience for the food system. We will all benefit from this. But why should the farmers be the one to single-handedly carry the burden of the investment and carry all of the risk that these investments will be successful? I'm not sure that blended finance is really the key answer to that, but I think that we need to collaborate in between all stakeholders throughout the value chain in order to help build the resilience of the food system. So if you look at the smallholders, they are currently having lack of access to just about everything that makes their small-scale business viable. They have a lack of access to affordable inputs. They have a lack of access to good infrastructure to provide efficiency. They have lack of access to extension services that can give them the knowledge that they need to improve their productivity, to build their resilience. They have lack of access to finance and insurance. And when it is available to them, it comes at an incredibly high cost. And that's a high cost for the farmer, but it also has a high cost for us as a society, because the vulnerability in the food system is there and it's going to impact us all. And then lastly, they lack access to markets, transparent markets and global markets. So we need an effort across all stakeholders in and around the food system in order to jointly reduce the risk for each and every step of the way, so that we can build the resilience in the food system that we need. So I'm not going to be able to make that happen, but I'm hoping that all of us who have a relevant role to play can come together to look at innovative ways of resolving this conundrum.
Can I ask a follow-up question immediately? Thank you for giving us the insights into the food system and agricultural sector. But you said that the cost of capital is high. Could you please make sure that all of us understand why is it so high? Number one, and second, how does that impact your investment decisions, your internal discussions in Yara about where to go next and what to focus on, what next priorities are, and also the reactions or reflections from the investment community when it comes to Yara's strategy?
I think when I talk to investors who are looking to fund sustainable agriculture, and we can put regenerative agriculture into that bucket, their main point is always who can help us aggregate the farmers. Because each and every smallholder farmer has a very, very, very small business operation. So the number of transactions are very large. And of course, farming is risky. Every season, the farmer is exposed to price fluctuations. They are buying our products as inputs long before they know what the price of their outputs are. So they have the price risk. They are exposed to weather conditions. Will it be a rainy season? Will it be too hot? Will it be too wet? Will there be flooding taking away all of the crops? So this inherent risk of agriculture is something that also drives the cost of capital. So I think the aggregation, so how to get the number of transactions up to a investable level is one piece. And the other is the very real risk of agriculture and how to mitigate that.
Thank you so much. We'll continue the discussion afterwards. Now we're talking about investments in emerging markets. Africa, that is at least a big part of it. So let's talk with an actor who actually has Africa as its home market. African Financial Corporation. That is a Pan-African multilateral financial institution. It was created with a vision to develop infrastructure in Africa and be the leading infrastructure provider. Sanjay Gupta, please.
Could I have the microphone? Yeah, hi. Obviously, the intention was to create a bit of noise, but then a lot of noise is already there. So I'll do the opposite now. I really wish the minister was here because I wanted to thank her personally because it's good manners to thank ministers anyway. But more importantly, because a lot of what she said, at the risk of sounding very cheeky, was almost a part of the hymn sheet I like to sing from. And that's pretty much what I'm going to try and highlight. Because if you see the topic, the way you framed it, you asked us to talk about risk and risk mitigation. And I think given the expertise that's in the room and outside this room, in many ways, what I'm going to say about risk, be it political, credit, currency, expropriation, development, financial, you name it, has been said, right? Has been talked about, and many, many solutions exist. So if you'll allow me, I'll just move away from that beaten track. Not that the track is not important, but the track doesn't need more commentating on it. But I'll instead talk about the risks I see in terms of a few trends or few realities which people need to accept if risk is going to come down. And the first risk I see is the risk of not understanding our own history. You know, as they say that when you don't know your history, you're condemned to repeat it. And in many ways, when I look at the cycle in the global world, it's almost a 40-year phenomenon. In the 1940s, we had the Bretton Woods institutions trying to tell us how this world will move forward together. 40 years down the line, in the 1980s, we had the Washington Consensus on Trade, saying how the world will trade together. Now we're talking about 40 years again, ironically or coincidentally, that, oh, we will all look at this climate agenda together. And that's the risk. I'll tell you why it's a risk. Because we are not in it together. And that is the other risk, the risk of not understanding that for us to say we have a common solution, we have to accept we have a common problem. We don't have a common problem. In the emerging markets in Africa, our level of development is nowhere near yours. Our level of emissions is nowhere near yours. When we talk about water, we talk about supply. When we talk about electricity, we talk about shortage. When we talk about food, we don't talk about consumption. We talk about nutrition, minimum nutrition. So that is the other risk, the risk of trying to find a common solution to an uncommon problem. The third risk is the risk of forgetting that at the altar of the renewable agenda, forgetting the development agenda, the point that the minister made, and I'm glad she made it, that renewable is important, climate is important, but the risk of not encompassing that within the overall ambit of development, and I'm not going to get into it because I don't have the time, is important. Because otherwise the risks you talk about will remain. They will not go away, however much you create blended solutions and what have you. And the fourth and the last point, and the risk, is the risk that the global world, the G7, the G8, the developed world itself faces. Because remember that if you do not appreciate that by developing an Africa or developing an emerging market, it is not a solution to your own problems, you're running the risk of not understanding your own problems. Food security, energy security, even simple thing like managing your migration problems, managing terrorism and fundamentalist trends that is developing in the world has to therefore come by you guys understanding that in Africa there is a risk of you not solving your problems, not managing your problems, and therefore their problems will become yours. Do you see where I'm coming from? That don't do it for Africa. You need food security. You need global supply chain diversity. You need energy security. You need to make sure people don't come knocking at your borders without passports. So therefore, do it for yourself. So that's why I thought that if you, I hope I haven't digressed too much, that the risks are the risks of not understanding the realities of history, the realities of the need for development, and therefore the risk that will come into your doorstep. And those risks will then be yours. It will not be ours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Can I ask a follow-up question immediately? So are you basically saying that the institutional investors or the capital in the developed world is hiding behind a risk concept, forgetting about the bigger risk picture?
No, so I would like to give you an answer based on realism, because I do work for an institution which by God's grace is a successful institution. You know, we are an African institution, but we are managed to be profitable all the time. We pay dividends. We are rated very highly, A3, which is like unheard of in the African context. We do raise money from everywhere. When I say everywhere, I mean everywhere. So I would be the last one to say that capital is not coming when there is a project. Enough capital is not coming, but I do take responsibility for it, because it's one thing to talk about it, but quite another thing for us to be able to be capital ready. And that is our job. That is nobody else's job. We have to spend the money. We have to use our intellect to develop bankable projects. It cannot be that the global private sector will come and take certain risks. It has to be us. So I would like to just assure you that this is not a complaint session. This is not a session on you did it, therefore I do it. I'm just saying that, obviously I've said enough. Okay, so you know what I've said. That essentially all I'm saying is there is money out there for the right projects. It's our job to develop them. No arguments. There is risk mitigations, as you said. There is allocation, as the minister said. We have to be ready. However, the broader issues, if they don't get understood, the momentum will not gather. That's all I'm saying. We will still be managing drops in the ocean rather than the ocean itself. If kind of that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Time to move to Asia. I'll introduce now to Marat Sapara. He's the CEO of Pentagreen Capital, which is a debt financing vehicle dedicated to accelerating the development of sustainable infrastructure in Asia. So you're a blended finance vehicle in practice, right? So please, Marat.
Thank you so much, and Mr. Gupta, thank you for those remarks. Very insightful, a lot of food for thought. I hope to perhaps take a slightly different track. I'll have to bring it a little bit back down to earth in terms of what we are doing, and bring it back to the blended finance construct. We are trying to solve a niche problem that's part of the bigger problem. We're trying to solve the problem of finance in situations where there is elevated amount of risk. So I'm based in Singapore, and Pentagreen Capital is a financial institution that has been established in Singapore. It is a new financial institution. It is intended to be a blended finance financial institution. In Asia, particularly in the emerging and developing parts of Asia, we have overall a very similar problem. We have a lot of projects, we have a lot of developers with projects, we have a lot of needs for capital. However, and first of all, we also have capital out there sitting in banks, sitting in institutional investors, in pension funds, insurance funds, and various other sources of capital. But the two are not being matched in a way that there is a transaction, so that capital is not flowing where it is needed the most. And that is in the higher risk projects, higher risk situations. We are specifically focused on infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure. So all of the situations that are interesting to us, like renewable energy, like the electric vehicle ecosystem, wastewater, circular economy, all of these very interesting projects, situations, and assets that need to be accelerated, need to be financed. Somehow, today, traditional sources of capital are not financing those situations in a big way. And it comes down to the problem of risk. So a couple of things to say about us. We're backed by Temasek and HSBC, who have committed capital to this entity to essentially get it going and implement it. We have the support of Asian Development Bank and Clifford Capital, who are helping us get this entity off the ground. And we have the ambition to deploy over $1 billion of loans into the space that we're working on over a period of 5 years. Our ambition is to be a blended finance construct and find a way of channeling the private sector capital part of the blended finance equation into the projects where we see the need in Southeast Asia and South Asia. All of these projects that have this higher level of risk that may potentially be acceptable or palatable through to the traditional financier or the traditional institutional investor. Some of those risks I outline on the slide, and there are a multitude of them. And ultimately, it comes down to the point that let's take Vietnam, for example. In Vietnam, we have a huge renewable energy and overall power need. The renewable energy projects that have been done so far, in large part, have been funded by equity or the local bank market. International banks, even multilateral development banks, never mind international institutional investors, have not come into the debt portion of those projects in a big way. And in many sense, you ask the question why. It's a risk-reward proposition. A Vietnam renewable energy asset, if we talk in terms of credit ratings, might deliver you a single B or at best a double B credit rating or its equivalent. And that's a deep sub-investment grade. It's what's called junk financing in terms of credit rating. And if you look at the reward that is associated with that kind of project, what yield can it deliver in order to be affordable to the population, in order to be affordable to the electricity off-taker? Well, that yield is nowhere near commensurate with the level of risk. So if I'm an investor and I go out there in the market today and I'm looking for that junk bond type of yield target, I can get 10%, 12%, maybe even 15%, right? Depending on which market I look at. In Vietnam, for these type of projects, I'm at best at 8 or 9. So how do we solve that problem without raising tariffs to a point where it just becomes unaffordable? And Vietnam is also not a rich country. It is still this in the middle income spaces, to use the World Bank classification. So to us, it's about using blended finance. And to us, it's about taking those assets and taking those situations which have that higher level of risk and somehow credit enhancing those situations such that we take these renewable energy assets, we aggregate them, we pool them together, we put a first loss tranche or other level of protection from donors, philanthropies, or the public sector. And therefore, the yield that we're ultimately able to deliver to the private sector investors that come through Pentagreen, number one, it's a better risk profile. With those tools, we can perhaps get to investment grade or above. And number two, the return is also commensurate with what's available out there in the public markets. So that's the transformation that we're looking for. And I just have one slide left, and I will perhaps conclude with this. I was similarly very happy to hear of the efforts that Norway is making into channeling capital into this climate space. Norway is a great friend of Singapore, I'm fortunate to say. And so with the Pentagreen construct, we look forward to doing our part to solve perhaps a small part of this problem. Thank you.
Please take a seat, all panelists. I think we'll continue where your point, Marat. You talked about the credit ratings, and we know that most of the emerging markets countries have a credit rating of B or lower, which is sub-investment grade. if you then compare that with a pension fund or typical institutional investor, is it possible to do in a way to add up for the investment grade? Start with Leah, perhaps.
This might be. It's not working. So the question is it possible to build up to that investment grade? We're looking at structured finance, and structured finance, that is ultimately the purpose of structured finance and how deals are structured. So in any marketplace, putting blended finance aside, and I tend to call blended finance structured finance for good. Ultimately, those structured finance solutions are meant to solve a market failure. They're meant to solve a very specific project level issue. They're meant to solve an investor concern and or group of investor concerns. And in this case in particular, the debt, sort of the ranking of that debt, A, B, C, junk, whatever you would call it, that is an investor level concern. And so there is a market adjustment that should be addressed and can be addressed through this structuring process. Through that, at the same time, we don't want to create misallocations. We don't also want to create Band-Aids and then suddenly rip those Band-Aids away such that we're leaving the economies in desperate situations. And then lastly, I think it's important that we don't create market distortions. So the way in which we're evaluating these structured finance for good solutions require a different set of measurements than we would use in sort of a traditional Wall Street type solution.
Yeah, so yeah, it's true that most emerging markets, particularly Africa, we essentially dealing with 95% of junk status as far as rating is concerned. But the way we've tried to mitigate that is because we do have a great rating, and we protect it like you can imagine, that we create wraps. We provide credit wraps. For example, last month, we provided a credit guarantee for $1 billion issuance by a Nigerian bank. And they saved almost 500 basis points because we gave them the credit wrap. We have also created structures out of Luxembourg, as it turns out, where we have wrapped up our project finance paper or loans into paper and issued it as AFC paper with an additional credit enhancement through Lloyd's Insurance. And we managed to sell it to UK and European pension and life funds. It was possible because yields were so low a couple of years, well, a year back, that any yield was comfortable for them to accept. We've also done something else, which is we've been using a lot of insurance on our own project finance transactions. That means there is a leakage of the yield. You give away 2% almost, but it creates the ability to bring in more global private sector finance. And the last point I'll make is that it's early days, but in the last year alone, we have managed to bring in 4 African pension funds into the infrastructure assets that we have. So it's a very refreshing trend that we hope sustains itself.
Bernhard, you mentioned that you've had both failures when it comes to investments in emerging markets as well as very successful cases. So based on what you've done so far, what have you learned about risk mitigation?
How to put it, choose the right partners. I think mainly, well, from a financial perspective, Yara is a global company, so we can carry the investments wherever we go in the world on the back of Yara Corporate, which is a triple B, high-performing triple B company. So I think in terms of the financing of the projects that we want to see, that is not really the key item. The key item here is really how we integrate the proper risk assessment into our decisions. I already mentioned that we have large-scale investments in multiple developing economies. In addition to that, we also have more mid-scale investment into infrastructure all around the world. We're operating in 60 countries, including a handful in sub-Saharan Africa, throughout Latin America, Asia, etc. So we we do recognize that the risks are different depending on where you are operating. In particular, we see a very strong need to be robust in how we assess and manage risks linked to ethics and compliance and criminality. And the profiles are different depending on where you're at. Just to give a very hands-on operational example, so we were operating in a port in a Southeast Asian country where there were facilitation payments for every shipment coming in. In such situations, we typically engage with other companies who are using the port to see if we can take a joint stand on this and try to make informal facilitation payment into a formalized public scheme so that we don't get caught into taking actions that are not compliant with our own way of our own code of conduct. In this particular case, that wasn't possible, so we ended up moving away from this port, purchasing infrastructure in another port and operating in a different port entirely, still serving the same market, but we just had to change logistics. So that's just a very hands-on operational example of how we're exposed to different kinds of risk depending on where we're operating, and how we need to move around that, and how we need to make sure that we are not taking on board risks that we are not prepared to do.
I would like to spend some time on the discussion about real risk versus perceived risk. The minister was also very clear about that, clear message to investors that you have to understand you're often exaggerating, or the perceived risk is often higher than the real risk out there. So what myths are there to be busted, Marat?
I think it's a great question, and indeed there is a difference, perceived risks and real risks. When asking debt investors in particular to take that extra level of risk, this topic comes up again and again. And sometimes, and maybe I'm somewhat biased, I'm a banker by background, so maybe I defend my cohort a little too much. But asking banks who ultimately keep deposits of all of us, retail deposits, corporate deposits, asking pension funds which keep our retirement savings and look after them, asking insurance companies which, I hope my insurance premia are well protected and are there when I need them, asking that cohort to take an elevated level of risk may not be extremely wise, and in any way may be prohibited by regulation, also for good reason, right? This type of financier. So I will come to that. I have just the answer. And sometimes it's perceived versus real. However, in order to really mobilize and motivate those types of investors to come into the projects that have that elevated level of risk, you need a risk mitigation tool. You need something that will cushion if those perceived risks come to materialize, or if the real risks come to materialize. You need a real cushion that can absorb that and still protect the savings, the deposits, and so on and so forth. And that is where blended finance can be a real powerful tool. That's where these structures like guarantees, like first loss, all of these things, they can really be a powerful tool. And it's a real sort of win-win solution. There are many win-win solutions out there, right? Often it's hard to find those types of solutions, but here it really exists. You have a pool of funding capital from philanthropic sources, from government sources, which is ready to take on risk. And you have a pool of capital from the private sources, which needs a certain minimum level, right? Which cannot go below investment grade or whatever that is. So by combining the two and by making sure the private sector element is insulated from those elevated risks, that can be really powerful. because they can mobilize the capital that's sitting within the private sector, the dry powder that's out there.
Yeah, so obviously operating in Africa, we do suffer from risk perception being more than the reality. And I'm not saying it to prove a point, it's a fact. If you look at data on project default rates in Africa, it's actually after the Middle East, the best experience. But that doesn't mean that there is no risk. I don't want therefore everybody to queue up and say Africa is risk-free. What I'm trying to therefore say is that risk can be managed. And maybe that is why projects take time to close, our projects, because the amount of analysis, risk mitigation, additional layers of insurance, what have you, that we bring in, we almost create an over-engineered situation. But if that's what it needs, that's what it needs. The comment I would like to make to global private sector when they talk about emerging markets, especially non-emerging markets like Africa, as in like data is still limited, capital markets are not there, information flow is not consistent, is that people need to take a little bit of trouble to talk to local institutions and work with them. I mean, you made a tongue-in-cheek comment just now that the biggest risk mitigant is to find the right partner. I mean, that's very profound, but that's very true. That continually we see, and we don't like it, that how many times opportunistic private sector capital comes into the continent thinking they've got the best deal in town. And when they make the mistakes that they do, it is not good for us because bad stories spread faster. So all I'll say is, yes, there is risk, no question. But our own experience shows risk can be managed, albeit with a lot of over-engineering. But at the very least, work with local institutions. Don't go alone. You know, in Africa, we have a proverb that you want to go fast, go alone. You want to go far, take a friend. So take a friend. Thank you.
And just to add to this conversation, we often look at it through the private sector lens versus the development institution lens. So a minister stood up here and said, the best use of my capital is actually blended finance or something along the lines. I'm ensuring to the best of my ability that a significant portion of ODA goes towards mobilizing private sector. Why is that important? Because they've done their homework too. And development institutions have to make a decision. Are they programming it against ODA? Are they pursuing a workshop, a needs assessment, or are they going to move in a different direction and make it catalytic? And so we have to understand, I think very much to your point, in that the private sector is moving at a slow rate, but it's moving, and it's up to development institutions and donor institutions to close that timing gap. And the last thing on this too is private sector, banks, insurers, we want them to look at historical data. We want them to price out risk according to historical data. And so every transaction that goes through the door, specifically those that are blended, the data is critical to feed into those models. So the question is, do we have the data? The answer could be yes. Then the next question is it being fed into the right models to then readjust those perceptions?
First, before I'll let the audience ask questions as well. First, a question to Sanjeev. When you're talking now about the blended finance mechanisms, do you believe in that as an important part of the solution? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I made that comment that almost all our transactions have a blended component to it when we develop it, when we invest in it, and then when we distribute it. So we use guarantees, we use insurance, we use our own rating as a way of guaranteeing issuance at the project level. So yeah, I mean, we do a lot of that. In fact, we've been telling the DFIs in Europe particularly that rather than doing funded transactions, do more unfunded transactions, because that allows the European private sector to come in a little more comfortably. I'm not saying that you should throw money, but you know, an unfunded transaction creates its multiplier effect. Funded transactions don't create as much multiplier effects, right? Okay.
So are you saying that we have the blended finance tools already? It's more a question about taking them into use rather than creating new ones.
I was earlier in the day on a panel with one of your colleagues from Convergence, and the takeaway was that indeed there are multiple tools which can all be applied. Let's not reinvent the wheel. I think the analogy was let's keep it plain vanilla. Big dollops of vanilla ice cream is what we need, rather than complicated structures in multiple different situations. This is what we have realized, and our shareholders realized at Pentagreen. So we want to blend essentially upstairs, above the project, and aggregate, and I think that's the way to go.
It's a very important point, and also there's the notion of measuring this by achieving scale. So through the replication, ideally, we're achieving that scale. However, I don't want us to underestimate the importance of looking upstream. So what we're focused on here in this point in the conversation in terms of replication is oftentimes downstream. These are structures that Wall Street financial entities understand, they can do, they can pursue. Development institutions are stepping up, they understand their point of participation. Where we continue to need to apply focus on innovation and creation of new blended finances upstream, i.e. business models where it's a startup entrepreneur that's in a position of raising capital from both concessional and donor and private sector. And those are ultimately the business models that'll feed into the funds in the emerging and frontier markets.
We're now talking about blended finance as a tool to mobilize institutional capital. If you look to a corporate like Yara, do you see a role for blended finance when it comes to what you're trying to achieve?
I think maybe first of all a bit more personal reflection. So I'm the sustainability guy. I used to work with Yara strategy, but then I was moved into the finance department because we need to have sustainability embedded into how we are making our investments. So it's more about monitoring of implementing the strategy. So when it comes to the actual world of finance, I'm a bit of an illiterate. But listening into the conversation that we've had just now, I haven't really heard anything that resolves the conundrum that I wanted to raise. So how do we actually provide financing to build the resilience for the millions and millions of smallholder farmers? Because on the one hand, doing that is a very complex operation. It requires collaboration from both the input side, from the farmers, changes in farm management, but also the off-taker side and the infrastructure. So the question comes a bit back to who aggregates, who builds the project portfolio, who can be that middleman who can put this whole thing together in order to create those big lumps of vanilla ice cream that you're talking about. We as Yara have made some attempts in setting up business as unusual initiatives, including helping to set up farmer cooperatives to both have a knowledge sharing mechanism, but also purchasing power and negotiating power towards the market. It worked to a certain level, but at the end, this farmer association was not able to get financing to scale up from like 15,000 to 150,000 farmers and beyond, because the perceived risks of financing the associations were too high. So we kept it as a crumble on the plate. We're very far from being able to add those lumps of vanilla ice cream. So I'm struggling to see how we can create that scale quickly enough in order to resolve those huge tasks that need to be resolved. So that's a bit the challenge that I'm still sitting with.
Julia, you mentioned that the blended finance can be used in multiple sectors, but it's very huge different when it comes to market readiness for blended instruments. Perhaps you have a comment on Bernhard's comment.
I'm happy to, because The point you're striking is very important, and it gives us pause because we sort of want to get ahead of those challenges and almost pretend they don't exist somehow, and then solve for other challenges without addressing some of the core challenges that you're raising. So one thing that comes to mind immediately that's less blended finance per se, but important to finance is collateral. There's a lot of, in the regulatory environment in Africa, certainly in other countries, is where there's an inverse aspect that the majority of farmers tend to be women, but they don't have access to the collateral they need in order to get less expensive capital, and then the capital that is ultimately provided to them is quite expensive. So I think one of my first reactions is sitting down and understanding the regulatory environment, enabling environment in these countries with respect to access to finance. There's an act that was passed in Senegal and I think up into Tunisia, and it's quickly spreading like wildfire. The hope is, which is a startup, it's more or less called the Startup Act in Africa, and it's addressing that core component. It's making it possible for venture capitalists to come in, refinance, exit. Peter Thiel just entered the marketplace in Senegal, one of the largest valuations in digital finance. The reason I raise that is legislation, regulatory environments are not discussed here because we're all coming at it from a very mature perspective. That portion of our ecosystem has been developed from a developed world standpoint, but in some of these, locations, that's still a very does present a real set of risks that truly needs to be addressed through conversations with ministers of finance and other.
Let's open up for the audience. Any questions?
Est-ce que je peux parler en français? No? Bon, I try to do it very simple. Thank you for this meeting. My first question is today, you know, the biofuel, les bioénergies. Biofuel is a solution par rapport aux classic fuels. Why the sector of biofuel no finance, no investment on biofuel? Pourquoi? First question. Second question. What is the relation between immigration and climate finance? One, you know, the African young people in the Sahara, you have many young people who like to go in Europe because no job, no project for development. If we can help there to do a project, they can stay on the same place, no go in the sea, no. My question is for Professor Gupta. What is the relation between immigration and climate finance?
Two questions. What's the relationship between climate finance and migration, and why does biofuel attract investors?
Okay, so the relationship between climate and immigration is actually quite obvious because the impact of climate change on the African continent is huge, right? And because of the lack of formal interventions and quality infrastructure and lack of infrastructure, the climate change is affecting infrastructure that exists already and making it break down. Number two, rain patterns are changing. Like if you go to the Chad area, the Lake Chad is shrinking, right? Now, unlike somebody who lives in London, New York, or Singapore or Dubai, people who live in Africa, those sort of effect on the climate affects them directly in terms of food, in terms of living, in terms of transportation, in terms of diseases, in terms of not being able to send their kids to school, name it. And that has an economic fallout, which creates the vicious cycle of poverty, as I call it. And then, because you got the population growth in Africa is high, we know that. And the lack of development, lack of jobs, Which is, by the way, another point, that when will the world narrative think of stopping primary exports from Africa but adding value and create jobs? What will the youth do? They will obviously seek other pastures, excuse the choice of words. And that is where immigration is a problem. Another problem is fundamentalism. There is a direct correlation between fundamentalism and lack of economic opportunities. So that's the point I was trying to make. On the biofuel issue, I'm not an expert, but what I can tell you is that, and maybe somebody should comment, that there is a school of thought that believes that biofuel can affect food supplies and affect food inflation. And therefore, overall, it is not the right way to go. And there is also a volatility in biofuel supply. But I'm speaking as an uneducated person on this one. Thank you.
Are there any other questions in the audience? No? Okay, let's get back to my questions then. Sanjeev, you mentioned that if there are good projects, capital will come. And it is the responsibility of the developing markets to create those projects. So what's the situation there now? What needs to be done to create more good projects, bankable and climate friendly?
So I think there has to be a strategic clarity as to what are the driving factors that will support Africa's development and therefore create projects that are bankable and thereby create a virtuous cycle, right? So the strategic clarity that I think to a large extent that has to be accepted, and there could be various areas. One is the point I made just now, that a lot of African countries, in fact all African countries virtually, have some form of primary goods export. Be it oil, be it gas, be it food, be it cotton, be it timber, be it whatever. So the stance that we've taken is that why don't we systematically go around countries and say, hey, Mr. Gabon, you have timber and you export timber without processing it. Let's build the infrastructure for that timber to come to a special economic zone. Let's give you the energy solutions for people to be able to sit there and manufacture furniture out of it. Let's give you the drone technology to make sure you're felling the trees in the right way and replanting the right way. And let's give you a port and a jetty to export it out. And let's give you furniture shops and value chains for offtakes. And this is not a fairy tale. The one I described has happened. It's a live project. Anybody can go and see it. We are replicating that with cotton in Benin. We are replicating that with cashew in Cote d'Ivoire. In Chad, you may not know, Chad is source of livestock. So rather than exporting livestock to Saudi, we are saying let's process the animals here. We are planning to do that in DRC with battery minerals. Because the world talks about renewable. Where is the minerals going to come to make the batteries? So we're saying there are probably 10 or 12 processes required from cobalt being mined to cobalt being part of the battery. At least process the first two steps there. So that's how we want to solve the challenge of bankability. Not by creating projects that don't make sense, but by creating projects that adds value, creates jobs, and fits into a supply chain globally, which is thankfully, after COVID and after the Ukraine war, is more accepting of the need to friendshore, inshore, and diversify. So it fits into all the narratives.
And what is the role of government here in creating those strategy, and what is the role of the private sector?
Tongue-in-cheek answer is stay away. I mean, a little government is better. But in these cases, we have effectively managed to bring the government as a partner. Because we felt that by bringing the governments in, and by and actually we've contributed to their share of the investment as well through blended finance solutions. Because at the end of the day, if you bring the government in, then when the political moods change, it doesn't change the support for the project.
Yeah, to add to that, these are great examples, and at the macro level too, and holistic nature of them, and drilling down on sort of the micro level nature of what I've seen in some portfolios, especially on the donor side, is the lack of access to capital just to build a good, solid company that's attractive to an investor. And that could look as simple as sourcing talent. It could look like developing an ERP system enterprise resource manager or ERM system, or having someone to head up your marketing and communications at the local level. And I use those as just very, very practical examples. Or having a solid balance sheet, your numbers are in place, but they're not somehow translating into the Excel. And those are the things that investors look for. And so it's not too different than what an investor would look for in the developing world nature, but it's closing those small gaps. And I had the opportunity to work on a program called Venture Assistance within USAID, the Development Innovation Ventures. And it was very, very clear. We allowed for those enterprises to tell us how they wanted to use that technical assistance to become bankable, to become attractive to investors.
Just a reflection. Having listened to the minister opening this session, the narrative, the story about what development looks like has changed so much over the last couple of decades. In the past, at least in the Nordics, where I come from, aid was seen as us taking the great knowledge we have and deploying it somewhere else where they wouldn't have that knowledge, and this would, in the old-fashioned view, automatically translate to success, which of course it did. Fast forward a few decades, and now the discussion is evolving around local content, local ownership, and development has changed. Development funding has changed from being direct funding into establishment of an aid project into, as we're discussing here, blended finance, looking upon business development as really being the key purpose. And this is so logical because we understand that sustainability is about the E and the S and the G, but it's also about the profitability. If it's not profitable, it's not sustainable. So I just love this full change of how the discussion around aid and how aid can be leveraged into business opportunities with local content, with local ownership. I think that is tremendous. And also directly for us, it's really important to have the local content. So we are selling our products produced anywhere in the world, in any country of the world. So let's take Tanzania as an example. So we have sales agronomists on the ground there. So we have the products, they work well. But we also have people on the ground telling farmers how to maximize the profits from investing into our products. We can't do that by sending a guy looking like me from Norway to Tanzania to say, yeah, you got to do this and that with your farm. But we are hiring local agronomists who understand the local context on the ground. But backing up that agronomist, we have the research and development that we are doing across the world so that we can actually harvest from the knowledge of agronomists employed across 60 countries worldwide. And maybe just one policy nugget as well, also from Tanzania. I visited a commercial scale farm in Tanzania. They were in Arusha, so that's far inland. And they were producing broccoli and exporting with airplanes to the UK, and they had quite a good business doing that. But the farmer explained to me that they were not able to sell that same broccoli profitably in the Dar es Salaam market because with every border crossing in between the counties, they would have to pay a tariff to ship that product across the county borders. So before arriving in Dar es Salaam, that broccoli would be too expensive. So it's just an example of how regulations have a real life impact, but maybe not always the intended one.
I would like to go back to Marat with a question about projects as well, from an Asian perspective. What needs to be done to develop more bankable projects in Asia?
I think a lot of great points have been raised. I particularly love the one about making sure that more value is captured domestically in each of the countries that we're talking about, because that is development, and that is what creates ongoing cash flow, which can be used to essentially repay whatever investment or whatever debt that needs to go in to fund some of the capital requirements. The one aspect or one way of delivering more bankable deals that perhaps has been touched on less, but although some of the colleagues on the panel alluded to it, and I'm a big fan of this. You see, particularly in the infrastructure space, often the market participants, the bankers, the investors, the sponsors, we all get together and we say, where are the bankable deals? Where are the bankable deals? There's so much money out there. There are so many developers. Where are the bankable deals? Oh, and it's the government's fault. They need to sort out the regulation or the enabling framework. Or it's the bankers' fault. They're not financing the projects that we're doing. Or maybe it's the developers' fault. They're not creating bankable deals. So there is a problem. And yet, if you keep relying on all these participants, particularly the regulation side or whatever that is, then I think we'll be here and still talking about the same problem for a long time. What's happening in places like Vietnam on the renewable energy side, what's happening in the electric vehicle space across Southeast Asia, everybody talks, it's so early, it's so nascent, it will take a few years to develop. And meanwhile, the private sector and the entrepreneurial developers are just getting on with it and are testing these structures. And this is what perhaps you were alluding to, putting together constructs, running pilots, running, essentially creating, I don't want to call them startup businesses, but nevertheless, they are startup businesses in the more traditional sectors like energy or EV or whatever it is. And then those businesses start to scale and they need capital. And the capital that's out there will look at those situations and say, this is not bankable, this is too early, this is too small, this is not interesting, I need to roll up my sleeves, and anyway, the regulation is not there. So there need to be sources of capital for those sort of situations to allow them to scale. And then over time, those situations can become more mainstream for the larger financial institutions that are out there.
So let's wrap up this session with a last question to each of you. Mobilizing capital to emerging markets is one of the key questions being discussed here at the COP this year. So my question is there anything in particular, any outcome that you would like to see from the COP that you think will influence the capital flow? Or alternatively, what's number one on your wish list?
A real price on carbon set up in such a way that farmers can leverage their soil carbon as collateral, as you indicated. I think that's my number one wish.
I would love to see more ministers like the Norwegian minister earlier talk about the way they want to use public capital. And then I would love to see that start to filter into the execution so those intents are actually captured and capital can flow.
Yeah, was very much my wish, so I have to find a second wish instead, which would be along those lines, and that those leaders within those development institutions do come together, decide to co-create among themselves, and then co-create within and with the financial community to develop the next wave of financing for private sector, and specifically to unlock it. But basically just increased level of awareness and increased level of co-creation.
Yeah, so for me, I recognize that capital is a scarce commodity. It's never in abundance, and it is always a selective commodity. Capital will flow where capital wants. So my intention is not at all to suggest you need to invest in Africa because Africa needs you. My intention is to somehow make that capital realize that there are institutions within Africa, there are success stories within Africa, there are governments within Africa with whom you can systematically work to bring development, and by bringing development, reduce the risk, and by reducing risk, having better returns. Because it's possible. We've done it. And that's my sincere wish, that somehow capital flows, but flows to work with people who understand the terrain better and have the idea that the biggest risk we have is not doing anything. that's just going to increase our risk, never going to reduce it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was a good summary of this. Carbon pricing, more governments to see the opportunities that lies within in blended finance, and for investors to see all the possible partners and structures that it already is there. So let's hope for COP to we'll bring that to Norway as well. So let's hope that we'll see some results on those points during the 2 coming weeks. Thank you so much to the panel for sharing your insights.